Right, let's kick off. So thanks to everybody for joining this evening, old friends and new. I think it probably goes without saying that we've all had a pretty tough year. It's been difficult, it's been stressful, not just in our personal lives, with all that entails in terms of concern for the safety of ourselves or our loved ones, the restrictions on our daily activities, and for some people, even their jobs, but also in our thoughts about what's been happening to people in other parts of the world. And this has really been a particular worry in countries that even before the COVID-19 pandemic were faced with really high burdens of poverty, lack of access to healthcare or education, or even meaningful opportunities for employment. So we see really, if you look at the statistics, poverty is increasing everywhere. And we're worried that decades of improvement in the quality of people's lives, reductions in deaths from preventable diseases, all of these things have been wound back and undone right in front of our eyes. We've seen how lack of resources and systems, particularly health systems, but not just them, they've increased the burden of suffering many times over. And if we didn't think that strengthening countries' ability to withstand shocks was important before the pandemic, we certainly aren't lacking in proof for that now. As I've said repeatedly since the start of the pandemic, results and other organizations that we work with have been really clear that if we're to succeed in overcoming this big threat to our collective health and safety, we have to work in cooperation internationally, as well as having those strong health systems in place here in the UK, where we're lucky to be relatively well resourced as a nation. Our own Prime Minister acknowledged this in a speech back in the United Nations in September, though I have to say that this government's record has been patchy and inconsistent, to say the least. Its commitments to extra funding for famine and fighting rising food insecurity earlier this year were really very welcome, as have been its support for the work to find a COVID vaccine, and in the summer, its tremendous financial commitments to Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, to make sure that kids around the world can get immunised. However, these efforts seem, at least to me, to be sadly and worryingly contradicted by the government's recent proposed reversal of its previous policy to continue to spend 0.7% of the UK's national income on overseas aid, which last year amounted to around £15 billion. As a reminder, that's a proportional 0.7%, and by definition, not a lot in terms of our domestic budget, but it is a huge amount to spend well in poverty eradication programs. And many of you will be familiar with some of the statistics on what could be achieved with that level of spending. Just one example from the issues results works on is that since 2015, UK aid has helped save 1.4 million lives through essential vaccination. Based on this level of impact, the proposed cuts are likely to put thousands of lives at risk and deprive millions more of a chance to permanently escape from poverty. Those of you who know me well know that I could rant on about this for ages, but I'm not going to do that tonight because we've got an expert speaker who's going to take us through the detail of exactly what's being proposed in just the next few minutes. He's also going to be talking about what we in the international development sector are planning together to do about it. And again, without stealing his thunder, I just want to mention Results Campaigning Action, which is once again to contact your MP, asking them to oppose these cuts in Parliament. Now, we usually try our best not to overload MPs with too many requests at once, not the least of which because we don't want to risk you damaging your relationship with them, which needs to be sustained over time, because we know that beating poverty is a long-haul job. We're very aware that within the course of 6 weeks, we've asked you to contact them not just once, but 3 times already. First, on nutrition programs, and for the new folks, the UK's contributions to nutrition end at the end of this year, so that's quite urgent. Second, an extra urgent action last month on parliamentary scrutiny of aid spending, and then now, again, on the upcoming proposed cuts to 0.7%. As we'll hear in a minute, MPs are actually right on the critical path to preserving our aid program. So I've had to ask you to contact them again. Extraordinary times require extraordinary measures, and many MPs, particularly those like the ones that you have been contacting who are up to speed on international development issues, they will understand why you will be contacting them again now. And of course, it's up to you whether you feel comfortable taking action on this, given you've been in touch with them so much recently. You might choose to do something else instead, such as writing to local media, for example. Some ideas to guide that are in our action materials, but please do whatever you think is best. Our action materials are just a guide. It's your MP after all, and you know them best. Before we hear from our speaker, I'd like to give you a heads up on a couple of issues we're going to continue to work on in the coming months. First, obviously, we're going to need to continue to keep a careful eye on UK aid spending. Regardless of the size of the budget, it's crucial that the money we do have is spent as effectively as possible and on the programs that have the biggest impact on poverty eradication. The Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, has set out the government's priorities, which continue to differ from those that we hold in results in some quite significant respects, including a desire to spend money on economic growth programs in the banking sector, with less of a focus on what we call human development, which includes nutrition, health, and education. And in particular, this coming year is a critical one for nutrition, with the money pledged to these programs running out at the end of this month, with no replacement commitment from the UK in sight. That's hundreds of millions of pounds of spending every year. Now, the Japanese government is hosting the next Nutrition for Growth Summit a year from now in December 2021. That's a long time to wait with no pledges and no spending. So we need the UK to maintain its historic support for nutrition and for the Nutrition for Growth Summit to help gain sufficient commitments from other governments right around the world to keep up that momentum on nutrition, which, as many of you know, and as I mentioned earlier, is going backwards, propelled even faster by COVID-19. Second, on education. Some of you will be aware that the Global Partnership for Education, which is an institution that helps fund access to inclusive education around the world, needs additional resources. It's come to the end of its current funding cycle, and its replenishment, where it will be asking for more money, including money from the UK, will be needed in July of this coming year. Next year also sees the UK host the United Nations Conference of Parties, or COP26, the big annual international climate change negotiations. As well, the UK takes over the chair of the G7. So this is a really important time for UK leadership of the world stage, which makes a backward step on aid even more out of place at this time. Anyway, you'll be hearing more from results on these issues in the new year, as well as an update on some of the other issues we've asked you to take action on over the last year. I'll finish it there for now. That's enough from me. So before we turn to our guest speaker, I'm going to hand over to Dela for the usual roundup of all of your activities around the UK in the last month. Over to you, Dela. Do we have Dela? We can't hear. Can't hear you, Dela, I'm afraid.
I don't see her on the list anywhere.
No, she's definitely here. I do see her. Unfortunately, we don't seem to be able to hear her.
Oh, yes.
She says, I'm speaking, but you're not hearing me.
Okay. So Dela is saying...
I will dial in.
Yeah, we'll come back to her at the end. So what we'll do is we'll finish up the main part of the call 10 minutes early. 10 minutes should be good, right, Dela? And that will give us a chance to come back to you at the end. I think that should be fine. So let's jump straight on 5. Okay, well we'll play it a bit by ear. Let us know when you get back on, and we can make sure that your mic is working. So let's jump then straight into the subject of tonight's call. And I just want to check that our guest speaker is on before I go any further. Do we?
Hello, I'm here, Aaron.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, there you are. Hi, Adam. Great. Really good to see you. Right, so let's jump in then. So on to the main topic of tonight's call and introduce our guest speaker for the evening. This month, as I mentioned earlier, we're back on the topic of UK aid spending, which we've been doing that on and off for quite some time now, it seems. But we've invited someone who's been working really closely with results as part of the coalition of agencies that are advocating for a strong UK aid program that focuses on the people who are most in need and most marginalised. Our guest tonight's Adam Bailey, who is the UK and Ireland Campaigns Manager at the One Campaign. So hi Adam, welcome. Many thanks for joining us tonight. Let me just introduce you a bit and tell people about what you do. Adam works helping people from all walks of life engage in international development issues. He's previously worked on this, worked in the field with UNICEF, with VSO, Restless Development. Adam, on the call tonight, you can see everybody's faces. We've got volunteer campaigners from all across the UK, from Scotland to the South Coast, some with lots of experience on international development issues, some who are brand new tonight, but probably and almost certainly bring their own experience with them. Certainly everybody on the call this evening is really key to hear how they can support that and help in the fight against global poverty and disease. And we do hope, of course, that everybody's going to be able to take the action tonight and try and help us stop some of these pretty intense and damaging aid cuts. We're going to start, as we always do, by asking 3 opening questions that we've pre-prepared and we've shared with you in advance. And after that, we're going to open up the dialogue for anybody to ask a question. But before we do any of that, I always like to start with this question, which is to ask you to introduce yourself to people on the call. And also share with us, what is it that motivates you to do the work that you do at the One Campaign? What gets you out of bed in the morning, and why are you really excited to do this work?
Perfect. Well, firstly, a huge thanks for inviting me to come to this call. I've had the honour and the privilege to work with results in many different kind of spaces in the past with different organisations. And to be honest, the work that you do inspires me as a campaigner. I love your kind of grassroots approaches. And I believe in people power foremost, kind of, and how us as organisations kind of working in the charity sector or advocacy can kind of unlock that people power and support people to make their voice heard, to advance progress and fight inequality where it might be. In terms of my background, yes, I work for the One Campaign at the moment. Could I just quickly see a show of hands of people who have heard of the One Campaign? Great, that's a lot of high fives. Thank you very much. One for you. But yes, so the One Campaign is quite similar to Results in our model in the fact that we are an advocacy organisation which works with activists all around the world, mainly in kind of European bases and North America, but also increasingly in Africa. And it's really about empowering people to hold their decision makers accountable to end extreme poverty and preventable diseases, whatever they might be, by 2030, in line with the kind of sustainable development goals. So that's me. I'm one of you. I'm a campaigner, and I'm keen to see how we can all work together to make sure that these aid cuts are as either taken back or as unimpactful as they might be on the world's poorest.
Thanks, Adam. As most people on the call know, here at Results, our vision is all about helping people exercise their own personal and political power to really make change happen. And so, you know, when we do that, it's often really important to take a second and think back as to, you know, why we're doing it and what are our motivations around this, because that can really give us some incredible power to help take that work forward. Hearing people's individual stories is really critical in doing that. So thanks for sharing that about your work at One. We're going to jump across to our pre-arranged questions. We're having another slight technical hitch, so I'm not going to give you the number to text questions into just now, but I will in just a minute. Our first question is actually going to come from Edinburgh. So Edinburgh, can you introduce yourself and ask Adam?
Hi Adam, this is Lucy and I'm based in Edinburgh. My question is, can you outline exactly what cuts the government is proposing to the overseas aid budget? Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for your question, Lucy. So the simple answer to that is no, I can't. And the reason for that is that we don't know the details exactly in terms of what programs or which areas are going to be deprioritised by the government. So we know that the budget cut as it's kind of been put forward, is to move from 0.7 to 0.5%, which amounts to cuts of 4 billion by 2021. If you take into account the cuts which were announced over the summer, which were around 2.9 billion. So we know that there's going to be a 30% kind of cut overall. In terms of where this might sit, now there's a few different ways that you can look at it. So you can look at 30% over the current portfolio. So what we do in terms of our official development assistance or our UK aid money. If you look at that, there have been some kind of estimations of what the cuts could mean for people. So figures such as, I think Aaron actually mentioned one at the start in terms of immunisation and what UK aid has done, but if you take it on a year basis, it could lead to 5.6 million fewer children being immunised, and as a result of that, 100,000 lives a year which will not be saved by those critical immunisation and vaccination programmes. So those are preventable diseases. In the same way, in terms of education, you can see how this could lead to millions of girls around the world not accessing education every year, 940,000 fewer children a year able to gain a decent education is a figure that's been shared this week. And that goes across the portfolio of programs that overseas development kind of focuses on. However, what we do know, and what's been kind of coming out in some of the speeches that we've had so far, is the priorities that the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, has in terms of the programme moving forward. So he's talked about a focus on the bottom billion, which is kind of the extreme poverty angle, tackling climate change, biodiversity loss, championing girls' education, and UK leadership in the global kind of COVID response. So we think that means there will be some ring-fenced funding for some of the health initiatives, such as Gavi, which is the big kind of vaccine procurement and delivery global kind of grouping of different organisations which deliver that. And in the same way, some of the kind of COVID response work will be ring-fenced. But the truth is that a 30% cut will impact across the portfolio of programmes. And at the moment, we have very little detail in terms of where those cuts will fall and how long they will last. So there is also a bit of work going on, which is kind of trying to encourage that open and transparent process for making the impact assessments of where those cuts will be made, how those decisions will be made. And also, as Aaron said at the start, next year is vital. There's the G7, there's the Global Partnership for Education Replenishment Summit, there's COP. There's lots of big moments where we're standing up on the world stage and people are looking to us to kind of lead and galvanise international funding and political will for making the changes we need to respond to the pandemic, fight climate change, fund education, fund healthcare moving forward. And we know that basically with that reduced budget, we can't do all of those things simultaneously and maintain our current levels of support in terms of the UK, but also galvanise the international community to hit what's needed in terms of the big global targets.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, it's a very big year next year. Thanks for that answer. So technical update, if you'd like to ask a question, you can at any time put a question into the chat box. Please go ahead, and hopefully you don't have a problem finding the chat box function in Zoom, because we've all been Zooming for almost a year now. But if you'd like to text in a question on SMS, or if you're on a telephone, the number for that tonight is 079 0666 2571. I'll read that again. That's 079 0666 2571. And of course, for those that aren't on a cell phone and aren't on the Zoom and just dialing in from a regular phone, we'll also do an unmute and yell out your name and ask a question as well at some stage throughout the evening. So let's go across to our second question, which is from Manchester.
Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm Diego from the Manchester group. And my question was, how much difference will this make to poor countries?
Perfect. Thank you, Diego. So, I mean, to lay out kind of a little bit of background, UK aid is just one part of our development funding kind of around the world. So the UK is only one bilateral aid giver. There's also other economic assistance measures, loans, grants, debt restructuring programs, multilateral funding, private finance. So UK aid is just one component of a much bigger global picture. However, what we do know is what UK aid achieves. It's very easy because of basically the fantastic work that the Department for International Development have done over the last few years before they were merged with the Foreign Commonwealth Office to look at the impact that UK aid has in terms of kind of solving poverty, education, healthcare, humanitarian. All of this information is publicly available on the government website. You can search and see over the last 4 to 5 years exactly what UK aid has achieved. And therefore we do know what's at stake. Again, it's difficult to know the exact details of where funding will be removed from and where the cuts will be made based on this move from 0.7 to 0.5. But we do know that there is some really big exacerbating factors which need to be taken into account when we see this cut of kind of what's going on in the world. So firstly, we also know our economy has shrunk. So combined with moving the percentage from 0.7, which is based on how much income as a country we have every year, we know that our economy is estimated to shrink by up to 13% next year, which means the 0.7% in its own right would have gone down with the conflation of the economy. So actually what we're seeing is a loss on top of a loss. So not just a smaller economy, but the 0.5 is coming from a smaller pot. We already know as well that the World Bank has estimated that the pandemic will mean that an additional 150 million people across the world are at risk of falling into extreme poverty because of the pandemic. So that's another really big, there's more need than ever at a time when we're cutting our budget. And at the same time, we know that on top of kind of our general aid program, we're seeing aid being spent in different ways. And this has been a very sad thing in the last few months, especially since the last government have kind of taken power, is that we're seeing more aid spent by other departments. That aid is being used for programs which aren't necessarily poverty focused, or that they are kind of being used to boost a kind of economic position in the UK, or even in some cases going as far as kind of aid for trade. So this signals kind of that long-term shift of how our aid money from the UK is being spent. But we also know that now it's really needed more than ever, which is incredibly kind of upsetting at the same time. In terms of kind of one fact that I brought out, which kind of put it into perspective for me, was that it's estimated that this 4 billion in overseas aid, that could pay for, based on current kind of aid spending, 35 million children to go to school, or 52 million people to receive healthcare. So those two figures are huge and really show kind of that money is still in the aid pot, what it could achieve.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, really, really big numbers. I think, you know, when we start to talk about millions and billions, it can sometimes get very intimidating, the size of those numbers. And I do like to be able to say to folks and remind people that, you know, when we talk about 52 million getting access to healthcare, those are real people. I mean, that's actually, you know, that's 52 million people. Compare that to the population of the UK and what the budget for our NHS is, and you start to see some real value for money arguments for aid that are pretty hard to dispute. We're going to jump across to Birmingham for our third question.
Hello, from sunny Birmingham. Right, so my question, Adam, what happens now? Is there anything we can do to fight this decision?
Thank you, Caroline. And the good answer is yes, there is lots that we can all do to fight this decision. So what's going on at the moment is basically we are awaiting information on the exact parliamentary timetable in the new year. So at the moment, what we're hearing from our intelligence is that between late January and April, new legislation will be put forward by the government, which will basically either repeal the current law, which says we have to hit that 0.7 target, or put into a new law that we will seek to kind of hit 0.5 for a predestined amount of time. So long term, that's what we're looking at. However, I think it's easier to kind of break it down into three main waves or parts of the response. So firstly, there's this piece on the existing work on the proposed aid cuts. So finding out exactly where those proposed cuts might be, where the 2.9 billion, which was announced over the summer, which programs that will affect and what that will mean to our existing commitments to things like the vaccine kind of response across the world, climate, education promises that this government made when they entered government. So that's one piece. And within that as well, it's about parliamentary oversight. So I know Results, as well as One and other organisations have been working on how we maintain parliamentary scrutiny of the aid budget on an ongoing kind of piece of work. So there is talk about establishing a new Official Development Assistance Committee to replace the outgoing International Development Committee, which are kind of cross-party parliamentary groups which scrutinise how aid is being spent by the government. So within that kind of existing, we need to make sure, firstly, that the cuts, we have transparency of what's happening with them, and we need to make sure the parliamentary scrutiny of the aid budget is maintained. So that kind of falls within that as existing work. And then now, since we've had the announcement that these cuts are in the offing, it's really super important that there is a public backlash against this. When the Chancellor stood up and made the spending review announcement last week, he really made the argument that the reduction of aid reflects the priorities of the British people. And he made this kind of saying that at a time where our economy was contracting, there was a real need for us to make hard decisions, and this was a difficult decision. We need to cut our aid budget. Now, what we know is that 4 billion, although an awful lot amount of money, it's small money when you take into account the amount of money that the government has spent on the COVID response. It is almost equivalent to finding money down the back of the sofa compared to other areas that the government is looking to spend. And it is notable that reducing the aid budget was the only area that was cut in this spending review. There was a snap poll taken after the announcement that the government kind of commissioned through Comres, which showed that 61% of people in the UK supported the cut and only 13% opposed. So within this kind of initial reaction, there's a real need for people to reach out to their MP, talk to people in their local area, talk to the local media, and make that case loud and clear that this does not reflect the views of the British people, that there is a really strong constituency of support for the UK maintaining their promises to the world's poorest people. As we await the parliamentary timetable as well, so the government actually tabled this legislation, if we can make clear to them that this is something they might not win, or there might be a rebellion, or that the numbers are not actually for them in terms of getting this simply through Parliament, that might change their thinking in terms of even putting it to kind of a parliamentary process. So that's the second phase, is like there's a real need for that loud public response through people talking to their MPs, talking to their networks, and going into local media. Finally, when we get to actually the legislative process is announced, there is a need to engage all MPs within that in slightly different ways, depending on that MP's party, affiliation, their background, and their stance on aid. So we will be working across the sector with all types of organisations and working really closely with Results on this, but to influence those MPs who may be the difference between legislation being passed or not. So critical MPs are the rebels or influential MPs that can influence their colleagues or will not vote with the government in the Conservative Party. It's also important to look at a second group of MPs, which are those who are likely to vote with the government but sit on the fence, so could be swung to support our issues. The third grouping of MPs are those supportive MPs, so those who might drive the amendment process and holding the government accountable, making sure that there are time constraints on this change of legislation, and in turn to show them that they have a constituency support behind them. So even if your MP is a Labour MP, Lib Dem, SNP, it's really vital that they see that this is a key issue for their constituents. So they're going up, they're questioning the government, they're attending votes, and they're kind of driving the debate to hold the government accountable on this. And finally, if you are in a seat where your MP is hostile, anti-international development, you still vitally need to engage with them. And the reason is that if you show them that there are constituents that disagree with them, if you show them that actually you will hold them accountable and you will remember that they signaled to vote to get rid of the aid budget, and that they know that them coming out vocally and publicly on this issue could result in a potential backlash against them, they will be less likely. So you're almost removing the opponents and targeting them to try and show them that it's not worth engaging in this issue because it's a done deal. The government are going to lose this vote. So in summary, the role for supporters is critical on this. To be honest, as a campaigner, although this year has been really difficult, we've worked on aid for years and years and years, UK aid, and this is really a pivotal moment because this is the moment where it is front and centre in the national debate, and this is a moment for us to set the course for the next 5-10 years, and definitely for the course of this government's term, of kind of how we should do aid as the UK. So as well as a very difficult moment, it's a moment where we can have a huge amount of influence. So by getting out the vote, finding out how your MP intends to vote and trying to influence them to support this will help us in terms of building that support. You're also vital in terms of the parliamentary arithmetic. So through you and your engagement with MPs, that gives us valuable intel in terms of understanding the House and how many MPs are supportive, how many are against, or how many are kind of anti this, supporting kind of overturning the proposed cuts. And finally, kind of influencing the public is really important. Past this vote, we are here because there is a feeling in the UK that we want to turn insular and we want to stop. It's a cultural battle between those who kind of want a small Britain worried about itself and those who want an outward-looking, leading Britain on the global stage, doing the right thing for the global community. And by talking to the public and getting them involved in this, that's helping that long-term aim of having us as an outward-looking, forward-thinking nation.
Thanks, Adam. That's great. I think you started to touch at the end there on what different messages might resonate with different audiences, and I think there's a rich seam of questioning to dig into there that I won't start with because we've already had some questions in from the chat. So let's go to a few of those. I think we've got a couple of technical ones to begin with that I think are good in terms of filling out some of the answers that you gave to previous questions. One came from Jamil, and his reads, "Hi Adam, I read sometime last year that the existing aid budget would be expanded to include peacekeeping in quotes and other things. Does that mean the government has reduced the budget even more in real terms, given more things are categorized underneath it?"
Thanks, Jamil. That's a great question. In fact, there was a very, very useful blog which Save the Children shared today, which kind of categorized those new areas of focus for the government since they've looked at aid, which I'm happy to share in the chat, which will outline this much better than myself, as I am a campaigner and not a policy bod, I must admit. However, as I understand it, the problem at the moment is that the government is saying that it will do everything. It will maintain all our existing commitments to education, to healthcare, to climate, to humanitarian. But at the same time, it's saying aid needs to work in the national interest. It needs to build trade alliances. It needs to build economic growth. and it can't do all of those things. So there was a broader debate about how aid is defined and therefore what counts as aid. And to be honest, I think after this, the movement we're seeing in terms of the merger, the parliamentary scrutiny going, the cuts, that is the next big thing, is what are the rules which govern aid and what can be counted as aid, and therefore seeing that budget spread over more issues and less poverty focus kind of at the core component, which we've been so proud of our aid having for the last few years. One other thing I'd point to is that at One, we've done quite a lot of work on an index that we launch every year, which looks at how government departments spending and programs, and we score it based on transparency, effectiveness, impact, and there's one more measure that I can't remember, but I can share it again in the link. But basically it looks at all government departments who spend over 10 million of the UK aid budget, all the programs, and scores them on this basis. And that gives a really great oversight of basically effectiveness in those departments in spending our aid budget. The sad thing is that DFID, the Department for International Development, which has now been disbanded, was by far the most effective, transparent, impactful department spending the aid budget. The Foreign Commonwealth Office was one of the worst, unfortunately, and now they have oversight of the budget. So increasingly, we are seeing that move of aid away from poverty to serving other ends of kind of the British international influencing portfolio.
Thanks, Adam. And Naveed's chucked a couple of links to, we think the SAVE blog you're referring to, and definitely the One Real Aid Index into the chat there. Just a reminder to folks, if you're on the phones, you want to text in a question, the number is 07906 66 2571, or you can put it in the chat. We've got another couple of questions in the chat we'll go to first. We've still got plenty of time. One of them, they're sort of linked, so I'll ask them together, actually. Peter Lemer from the Stork Valley Group asks, I've seen surveys that show a high level of public approval of cutting UK aid. My take is that most of the naysayers don't actually know how much 0.7 represents, nor how effective our work has been. Isn't it a priority to educate the general public from the top? And along the similar line from Harriet Stewart-Jones, people are still talking in the popular press and social media about the Indian space program and the aid given to rich countries such as China. What are the easy responses? I think those are kind of linked questions.
Perfect. Yeah, I can give a go on those. Peter, lovely to see you again. I saw you on a campaign call a few weeks ago, I believe. So nice to see you on this call. So yes, you're right. Kind of the surveys that were done, and especially that ComRes polling that was kind of pointed to by the government, was very misleading. So I think the question was, do you support cutting the aid budget or focusing on domestic priorities? It was something around those lines. And you're right that the issue is that people who don't understand that our aid budget is only 0.7%, it's not 20%, it's not 30% of spending, will always ask for it to be cut. And actually, we shouldn't be going for the lowest common denominator in this argument of kind of persuading the whole public and everyone being brought on kind of international aid in this quite technical subject. But there are many other pollings that show the more informed audiences, when they actually understand how aid is spent, how much of it is spent, are massively supportive of the UK aid budget and maintaining those promises. So I agree with you. There is a real need to better educate the public on aid. But what I do think is the British public, time and time again, have shown they are generous, they are outward looking, they do support Britain driving things. When you tell them about the impact the aid budget has in terms of education or immunisation, they are massively supportive. What we need to stop doing, I think, is actually trying to make the public supportive of a target and try to make the public supportive of the impact that we're looking to achieve and a shared vision of the future that UK aid is part of us reaching. And by doing that, I think you move the conversation away from it's this money or this goes to us or it goes to them, and about shared priorities for how we want to live in a world with global problems that we all have a stake in solving. So I think there's a bit of a reframing that we need to do, but I also think there's a better way to turn it away from talking about amounts.
My question included, thank you. My question included the question that the changing of hearts and minds to happen from the top. In other words, what I'm saying is the media needs to be enrolled. And I really wanted a response to that possibility.
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few organisations trying to build more public support for international aid. So I think results are part of this, but there is a big study that we do, which is focused, called the Aid and Development Tracker, which tracks public opinions, messaging across 7 countries around the world and looks at how it moves. So what are people's propensity to donate? How do people feel about the aid budget? So we track those questions and use those insights to drive our media engagement and how we try to message these things to the public. To be honest with you, one of the main challenges is that this is a very low salience issue. So most people don't think about international development in their everyday lives. Most people, the only thing they see is that negative story about funding the Indian space program or funding countries which programs which have no necessary impact. And that leads to this easy misconception that all aid is wasted. And for many years, we've been trying to unpick that. And to be honest, it's a real challenge. And I haven't got any straight answers of the best way to do that, apart from that focusing on shared goals, shared value, and shared objectives to make the world a better place, and trying to move it away from a budget here or a budget there.
I always go back to what David Cameron said when he announced the UK's large pledge to Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, to vaccinate so many children when he was Prime Minister. He said, "I reject the notion that we have to choose between domestic spending and international development. We are a rich country; we can afford both." And David Cameron is obviously not flavour of the month right now. Most former prime ministers aren't. However, the statement, I think, rings true. The funds that have been found to fight the coronavirus at home are immense. My favourite statistic, £500 million spent on buying 20,000 ventilators, most of which sat in a warehouse because they didn't get used. £500 million. You do that 8 times, you've got our aid budget. So, the idea that the money simply doesn't exist is not true. And let's not start talking about the defence budget.
Yes.
Apologies. Don't want to take us off on too much of a tangent. I'm just looking to see. Kit has a question. Let's go to his next. Kit asks, aside from making the difficult decisions and saving money, were there any positives or a rationale given as to why the aid budget should be cut and where else that would be spent?
Yes. So the main rationale kind of given was that during a time of a global pandemic, when our economy has seen the biggest fall in 300 years, I think was the kind of the figure used, we should focus on priorities here. Where we've seen that money go, as already mentioned by Aaron, was we have seen the defence budget go up, and we've also seen the government promote this levelling up local grant scheme for local communities. So for community-based projects to level up as a response. Now those are very good, noble programs, but again, to Aaron's point that he just made, for us to detract from our commitments on the world stage, which was in every party's manifesto at the last election, which has been a target since 1970s for the UN, and the UK was the first kind of G7 country to meet that 0.7 target. And at a time when Britain is retracting from the European Union, is kind of, you know, our whole relationship with the world is changing, really does put a kind of flag in the sand to say, we are moving back from being that leader on the international stage. And that, I guess, is the most worrying thing, is that that target is about, if every country can reach it, no matter the size of their economy, everyone is contributing to making the world a better place for a tiny bit based on the size of their economy. And the UK was a real champion for that target before this. So yes, you know, it's quite disappointing that they've stepped back. And again, the other rationale which was given, which is important to point to, is the government said that this was a temporary cut. So the 0.5% would be the target from 2021 onwards, until the fiscal situation had changed to such an extent that they could return to 0.7 as a target. The problem with that is they gave no definitive timeline for that returning to 0.7. They gave no indicator of what measures would be taken into account. So would it be based on the size of the economy? Would it be a move straight after 2 years we'd return to 0.7? So at the moment, it's whether they use that legislation as a loophole to move away from 0.7 and then never return to it again. So there is a real need that, even if this goes through, is to make sure that it's time bound and there's a proper process for returning to 0.7 at a later date.
Thanks, Adam. Just something I'd like to ask you directly, stealing the chair's prerogative for just a second. You mentioned the Conservative Party manifesto, and I think there's something in there that could potentially speak to marginal Tories that might not care so much for aid, but do care a lot about keeping promises. We've actually called our grassroots action this month, you know, oppose the U-turn, which I hope you can sort of see where that name comes from. Could you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's potentially quite a compelling message to be able to include if you're writing to the kind of MP that would be amenable to that argument.
No, sure. Really, really great point. So ahead of the last general election, in every party's manifesto, all the main political parties, other than a few kind of more fringe parties, the 0.7 commitment was front and centre. Within this government's manifesto, I think the wording was, we promise to maintain a 0.7% funding of international development, a focus on girls' education and ending preventable deaths. So they put that kind of front and centre on their internationalism for what they got voted in for. So what we are seeing is some really unlikely allies in Parliament. So people who we know have been traditionally opposed to actually international development spending, coming to us and saying, we oppose these cuts because we stood at the last election, and this is on this promise that the government made. And we know that breaking an election manifesto commitment when they don't need to, there was nobody pushing for this change when they don't need to, is negative for those MPs' own relationship with their constituents and the party's own success. So many MPs are angry, even if they are less into international development as a priority area, because of that breaking of that promise to the British public that this kind of U-turn signals. So that does work with many MPs, that conversation, and to kind of talk about, you know, what this does for the public's trust in government for kind of so soon after they've taken a stance. It was written crystal clear. And even in the autumn, earlier in the autumn, they were talking about maintaining the 0.7 commitment. That's incredibly useful to kind of turn to. One other thing that I would say, I know Alan said at the start about you've had lots of actions at the moment. You've talked to them about the ODA committee, you've talked to them about nutrition. I would see this as a continuation of all those conversations. So actually, I am sure if you've written to your MP on any issue in the last 6 months to do with international development, they've mentioned their party is committed to 0.7%, because I see it in the correspondence I have with my MP, and I see it in all the supporters I support. So actually using that to play back at them and say, a couple of months ago, you said that your government was committed to this target. You put it in writing here on the 3rd of April 2020. What's changed? Why are we going against this? You said you believed in this target. So I think that's also a very useful way to kind of discuss and make clear to your MP that this is a change, a very big change on their position. Thanks a lot, Adam. I think that's actually a lead in to the last 5 minutes of the call, where we are actually going to go back to Dela. So we're going to come back to you before the end, Adam, so please don't hang up. I'm sure you want to stay for this part, being a campaigner. And the reason why I think this part's really important to end on is that what we're talking about here is a relatively small group of people forming common cause with thousands of other people around the country to try and direct literally £4 billion of government expenditure to make sure that it stays spent on some of the world's poorest and most marginalized people. And you may be saying to yourself, what can this small group of people do? This is where I think it's really important to remind you all that you're incredibly powerful. And what better way to do that than to talk about some of the great stuff that we've been doing and the stuff that we've been working on. So Dela, I'm going to throw over to you for the last 5 minutes to get some of those updates from around the network. Hopefully your mic's working this time.
Thanks, Aaron. Can you hear me this time?
Yeah, brilliant.
Great.
Thank you.
Sorry about earlier, and thanks, Adam. It's always great to hear from you. Thanks for all your insights. So yes, I want to just take a quick step backwards and mention the action that we're also taking on the parliamentary committee that's scrutinising aid, because I know a lot of you have reached out to your MPs about that already, and are essentially waiting to hear when the vote is going to be announced and when you can tell your MP to go and vote for better scrutiny on development. We haven't heard that there's a date being set, but it could be basically called at any point up to the Christmas recess, which is on the 21st of December. So just giving you a heads up and to say that we'll let you know when we hear anything about the date of that vote. I know some of you are basically waiting till it's announced to pick up the phone again to your MPs. So that sounds pretty sensible to me, and thanks for doing that. So essentially after the 20th, you won't be able to contact your MP in Parliament until January, but you should still be able to get hold of them in their constituency office, so give it a go. So I just will do a quick roundup of some of the amazing stuff that's been happening in the last month. So a few of us met with Sarah Champion MP, who is actually the chair of the current committee that scrutinises development. And I personally thought she gave us some really useful insights into what she's doing behind the scenes to kind of mobilise other MPs to vote for better scrutiny. And yeah, she gave us some really good tips on like how we might approach our MPs on that. I was going to throw it open, but seeing as we've only got a couple of minutes, maybe you can take that conversation onto Facebook or something if you want to share how you found the meeting. But yeah, thanks to everyone who came along. It was great to see you there. You've all been telling me about the actions you've been doing this month, which is fantastic. We've had so many people contact their MPs over the last month, including some new people, which is always amazing. Do let us know if you have taken an action and not told us yet, or if you've received any responses back from MPs. As Adam was saying, it's always really useful to basically get intel on what MPs are thinking about our issues at the moment. I wanted to highlight some of the cool stuff we've been up to. Some of the London group members, Richard, Layla and Tilda, have written 2 really informative and detailed blog posts on this topic of parliamentary scrutiny for aid. So I'm actually going to post all of the links that I'll mention now, so you have a chance to click on them before the call ends. But yeah, thanks for writing those blogs. Do check them out if you want to understand more about parliamentary scrutiny. And there's also a link in there to a cool little Instagram video that Tilda from the London group put together. I was going to screen share it, which is why my audio didn't work when I tried to speak, but I'll let you watch it in your own time. Yeah, I thought it was really cool. You've also been busy doing other media actions as well. Gill has written an amazing piece for the Independent Catholic News on the importance of scrutiny for AIDS. Definitely read it if you haven't yet, it's great. The Brighton group as well have been really busy. They just got a piece on the Sustainable Development Goals published in The Badger, which is a Sussex student newspaper. And when you click on the link, you'll see it's like a full page spread with an image. It's really amazing work. So yeah, thanks guys. What else? Basically, there's been so much energy in the network. People have been reaching out to their friends and family to get them to take action. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Sean, who kind of was initially in the Stork Valley group and is now going solo in Harlow and encouraging friends to take our Eat Action on Nutrition. And I know Lucy in Edinburgh got her mum to write to her MP in Cumbria as well. So that's super cool. Thank you. What else? I'll rush through this. So it was International Children's Day on the 20th of November. Yes. And we had Eleanor, Tamara, Sanjay and Becky help us out with a cool video that basically was targeting government ministers and getting them to understand the difference between hunger and famine relief and nutrition and long-term sustainable programs. So there's, I think, a link in the chat to that video. Thanks for being part of that, and thanks to everyone who shared it on social media on the day as well. Really appreciate it. Lastly, just wanted to mention that coming up in December, there are a couple of hooks that you could use for any media pieces you want to write about aid. Thursday, the 3rd, is the International Day for People with Disabilities, and the 12th of December is Universal Health Coverage Day. And obviously we work a lot on health, so if you need any help or resources to feed into your media pieces on that, just let us know. And not the most positive note to end on, but still not too bad. We're postponing the training we were going to have on the 12th of December, so you don't need to save the date. We will reschedule it for hopefully January or February, so we'll let you know. Obviously it'll be virtual, but it'd be lovely to see as many of you there as are free. So yeah, I think that's everything from me. There's been even more happening, but there's just not time to mention all of it. So just a massive thank you to everyone for all your campaign actions. Yeah, I'll hand back over to you to wrap up, Aaron.
Thanks, Dela, and a big thank you to all of you for being so active. It's just absolutely spectacular. You really, really don't ever think that it doesn't make a difference. The thing about how decisions get made, if we know, for example, that Dominic Raab himself, the 4th most powerful man in government, in government, was opposed to the aid cuts, that means there are only 3 people above him that effectively overruled him. There are a very small number of people pushing from the top on this decision, and I think with enough of a groundswell underneath them, we have every opportunity to get that overturned. And you never know exactly what conversation they're going to have is going to change their mind. It could be your MP, you just don't know. So that no effort is really going to be wasted here. It's all critically important. So we've really come to the end of our time here this evening. Sorry we're over by a couple of minutes. I want to finish wrapping up by saying a massive thank you to Adam. Adam, thanks for sharing your expert knowledge, all of your insight into the campaigning, into the processes and what's happening next. And of course, thank you for remaining with the rest of One, a really important and active partner of results work. For everybody, I hope you found this evening interesting, challenging but inspiring, and that you're all geared up to take the campaign action. As always, the materials we sent out last week give you all the details you need to explain the issue to your MP, some shorter talking points if you're in a hurry, links to all sorts of resources that are in the text if you want to read up more in depth. And of course, Dela and Naveed are on the end of a phone line, a Zoom line, or an email, ready to give you help and advice, particularly if this is your first time doing some of this stuff. So please let them know if you need help, if you've taken the action, and particularly if you get one of those beautiful yellow and green letters back in the post. The next Grassroots conference call, if you want to mark your diaries, it's going to be the 1st of next year, a new year, thank goodness. It's going to be a week later than usual because of the Christmas and New Year's break. So it will be the 2nd Tuesday of the month rather than the 1st Tuesday of the month. That will be Tuesday, the 12th of January, but it will be at the usual time of 8 p.m. Finally, and because this is the last call of the year, I really want to thank all of you for your excellent, committed and thoughtful advocacy for everything that you've done throughout the course of the year, particularly given how tough a year it has been. And like I said at the start, it's been a tough year, but our work has been needed more than ever and will continue to be needed next year. So look, take a great break over the festive period, relax, rejuvenate, and come back refreshed in January. Good night. One final thank you from me. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings. And if I don't see you before Christmas, have a great Christmas, a great New Year, and I will see you next year. Already looking forward to it.